Good morning. This is Daniel here with Cop Watch TV. I just wanted to welcome everybody into the live stream. We're going to go over some of the recent cases from this past week, not just cases that involve police officers, but some other interesting, police officer related news. So just like it seems like every week lately, there was a lot that happened. Also, some of the feedback that we got from last week, some of the questions that were asked in the comments section, I'm going to get to some of those as well. So I just want to invite everyone in and thank everyone from coming in. Actual Cactus says, "Hey, how's it going?" Looks like we have some people from Florida, from Colorado in here. So if you wouldn't mind putting in the chat where everybody's coming from, be curious to see if there's any different police cases, news that comes out of the jurisdictions that everybody's in. And also, kind of while we're going through this, one of the points is to, if you have questions, if you have comments, if you have a super chat, definitely put it in there because I want to interact. And if I'm saying something that you agree with or disagree with, or maybe you have a different take on it, put it in the chat. Let's work out some of these issues and address it. Again, if you guys haven't already, please make sure you subscribe to, follow, like Cop Watch TV, both here and on TikTok. Also, if you want to follow me, again, my name is Daniel. You can follow my channel at Police Law News over at YouTube and TikTok as well, where I do some daily content. But today we're going to get into some of the most important stories that happened. Hey, from Oregon. Oh, goodness, Oregon. I think we have some stuff on Portland later on today. Kansas, Texas. Oh, it's nice to see everybody out there. Heather Baldwin is from Albuquerque, New Mexico. That's a crazy place. All right. Okay, so here we go today. So the first case that I want to talk about, it's from an older case that I'm sure everybody is familiar with, but we'll go over a little bit of the facts, but mostly it's the legal updates that happened yesterday. So the Brianna Taylor case. This was in Louisville. I know I didn't say that right, but this was in Louisville, Kentucky in March of 2020. And the short story when it comes to the facts of the Brianna Taylor case, and this is one of the most famous or infamous police officer-involved shootings over the last couple of years. It's one of the main incidents that kind of caused and helped to incite a lot of the riots in the summer of 2020. And it's one of those cases that people point to when they think about, this is what's wrong with police departments today. This is what's wrong with law enforcement. Is the Brianna Taylor case is one of the cases that they point to. And there's actually a lot to this case. It's pretty complicated. So not all of it is police officers doing a bad job. There is some of that, but not all of it is officers just doing a bad job and not having an appropriate response. So some of the facts of the Brianna Taylor case, if you remember, this was in reference to a drug investigation. So Brianna Taylor's ex-boyfriend was someone named Jamarcus Glover. And Brianna Taylor, they had an on and off again relationship. And at the time, they were off again. So Brianna Taylor was not currently dating Mr. Glover. However, they still were in contact. Well, Mr. Glover was accused of drug trafficking, and as part of that investigation, there was accusations that Brianna Taylor was somehow, to some level, involved in the drug case. And during this one night, there were either 4 or 5 different no-knock warrants that were signed by judges that all were in reference to this one case. And the reason why police officers might do that is because you can imagine a situation where there's a network of individuals who are trafficking drugs. And if you say, okay, we have 5 houses that, we think might be involved in this drug trafficking case. So, you can't hit one house on Monday, one house on Tuesday. That wouldn't make sense because you can imagine that they would talk to each other, and any evidence that the police officers are trying to get from these raids, wouldn't be there. So it's commonplace for police departments to essentially execute all of these warrants for a single case, especially in something like when there's drugs involved, on the same day. So I believe there were either 4 or 5 houses that were hit at the same time. So all of them were signed as, I'll get into the Brianna Taylors in a second, but all of them were signed as no-knock warrants. So the first 3 or 4 that had nothing to do with Brianna Taylor, that had to do with her, but weren't at her specific residence, all of those were no-knock warrants, and all of those went down essentially without a hitch. There was no use of force, and more importantly, there were no officer-involved shootings. No police officers were injured, and no civilians were injured in those cases when there were no-knock warrants. When it comes to Brianna Taylor's case, and we have to look at what's being said, because some of the information I think it's fair to say we don't have all of the information, or the information we're getting from the different parties might be conflicting. But here's what we think, is that police officers did have a no-knock warrant for Brianna Taylor's apartment. So from the judge, they could have gone in with a no-knock warrant. So for whatever reason, though, they decided not to execute a no-knock warrant. So it's unknown if it was changed at the last minute from the judge or from the supervisors. If you listen to some of the officers who were there, I know one of them wrote a book and he's done podcasts, and I've listened to some of those podcasts, and he basically talked about, and he said something to the effect of, we didn't think that it was going to be dangerous going into Brianna's house. We know that she didn't have a criminal record, that she was going to be alone. We essentially weren't there to arrest her. We were there just for evidence in her house, and they thought that she was going to be alone. So they decided, this is what one of the sergeants said, they decided in the moment to not do a no-knock warrant, kick in the door, and wake her up like that in the middle of the night. So what's being said from the police officers is that they decided to issue a little bit of a courtesy by knocking. So they did knock, and then once no one came to the door, that's when they kicked in the door. And once inside the door, I think after 12 seconds or so, that's when the police officer was shot in the leg, and that's when the officers returned fire. So with that, there's a couple things. Is that Kenneth Walker, who it was Brianna Taylor's boyfriend, who was home at the time with her, in his interview that he did with the media, and in all the statements that he's made to law enforcement and attorneys that are public at this point, he says that the police officers knocked, that they heard a loud knocking. What he says that they didn't do is they didn't yell police. So he admits that, yes, the police officers actually did knock loud enough to where they were woken up by it, and they were able to hear it pretty loud, and that it was concerning to them because it was loud knocking. So the idea that police officers did conduct a no-knock warrant into Brianna Taylor's house just isn't accurate, because even Kenneth Walker admits that there was knocking. Now, the argument from the other side is that, well, so by them knocking, it woke up Mr. Walker and Brianna Taylor, and they were able to arm themselves with a gun, because there's Mr. Walker saying that he thought it might have been Brianna Taylor's ex-boyfriend, this Glover guy. So the argument is that, well, had they just conducted a no-knock warrant, just like the other 3 or 4 houses that night that had no-knock warrants, where there weren't any issues at all because you catch people by surprise, had they done a no-knock warrant, that probably would have saved Brianna Taylor's life, because they probably would have gotten into the house quick before really the individuals knew what was going on, which is the point of no-knock warrants. So all of this stuff to say that, no-knock warrants are bad. It's possible that they're bad, but a no-knock warrant isn't what happened in Brianna Taylor's specific case. And actually, if there was a no-knock warrant, it's likely the outcome might have been different. Okay, so then there was the officer-involved shooting. But what happened yesterday is the Attorney General of the United States, Merrick Garland, so he charged 4 different police officers involved in this case with civil rights violations. But it's not the officers who actually did the shooting. He even went so far as to specifically say that the actions from the police officers who actually did the shooting, except for one, we'll get that in a second, but the officers who killed Brianna Taylor, they aren't charged at all. What the allegations are and these allegations have been out there for a while, but the allegations from the Attorney General and the Department of Justice are that 2 of the police officers who were involved on the detective side, so the investigation side of writing up the search warrants for Brianna Taylor's house, that there was some false information, that there was a false affidavit that was signed that gave them, so essentially when they were applying for the search warrant for Brianna Taylor's house, that there was false information put in that search warrant. And based on that information that is false, that the judge used that as part of probable cause to issue a search warrant. And then there's an allegation that there was also a cover-up, that after the shooting, that the allegations that 2 of the officers afterwards got together and essentially had a meeting to see if they could get their story straight because the shooting occurred. So that's what some of the two of the charges are. And then there's a supervisor of the detective unit, and he is also being charged with civil rights violations. So there's 3 detectives who are, so two officers and a sergeant in a detective unit who are charged with civil rights violations. And then, so the last officer is Officer Harkinson. He was the officer who was actually charged with state charges for wanton endangerment, because what he did is he was kind of in a different area, so he wasn't in the apartment when the shooting occurred. But once the shooting occurred, he said that he couldn't hear really where it was coming from. And the allegation, for lack of a better term, is he shot wildly. So the allegation is he fired 10 times, and 5 of those times he fired through a door in a different apartment when he couldn't see what was on the other side. So he was actually charged in state court with charges related to that. He was acquitted of those charges, but he is one of the officers who was just charged with civil rights violations for unconstitutional use of force, even though his bullets didn't hit Breonna Taylor. They actually didn't hit anybody, but he was charged as well. So I think what's interesting in this is that Merrick Garland, so I think we have to separate, and this is what I've been saying for a very long time on this case, that the detectives who did the investigation are completely separate from the officers who executed and conducted the actual warrant. And I think it's important to remember that, because I think what happens a lot in the media, because they have an incentive to not be honest about it, is that they essentially make it seem like the people who wrote the warrant and maybe either did a bad job, were careless, or worst case scenario, lied in the warrant, those are the same police officers who went to the house and did the actual warrant, or they were all somehow related. But Merrick Garland went out in a 13-minute statement. He actually went out of his way to say that isn't the case. He said that the officers who conducted the warrant had no knowledge that there was any problem at all with the actual search warrant. So I know that a lot of people might be thinking, well, isn't it their responsibility to know like what's in a warrant that they're conducting? And that's a really good common sense question to ask. But I just want you to think about it this way. And this is really common in mid-size and larger police departments that have a lot of officers. So if you can imagine a situation, this is what normally happens. They have detective units who conduct surveillance, they conduct interviews, they talk to CIs, informants. They're the ones who write up warrants. And then they get approved by the district attorney and then a judge, and then it goes to a different unit who just conducts the warrant. So if you're one of those officers or the supervisor of the unit of who's conducting warrants, you have a warrant signed from a judge. So the idea that you don't have any idea, maybe you get 1, 2, 3 of these a day, a week, who knows? But the idea that you are going to go back and to do like a separate investigation on a complex drug investigation that took months for a main detective to do, the idea that you're going to go back and do that doesn't make sense, because you have, from the perspective of the officer conducting the warrant, you have a detective or an officer who wrote information in a probable cause statement that they're putting in there under oath. That's approved by a police department supervisor. Then that goes to the district attorney's office for approval, and then finally it goes to a judge. So when you're the officer conducting and executing the warrant, you know this process and you have it signed by a judge. So at that point, to go back and do any other investigation on it, it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And I just want people to realize that there is a definite distinction, and two things can be true at a time. The officers, I'm not saying this happened because they haven't been convicted of anything, but it's possible for officers who did the investigation did put some false information in an affidavit. If they did that, they should be charged. Absolutely. If police officers lie under oath in order to get a search warrant, there's no question that they should be charged. I don't think anybody has any sympathy for that, because our civil rights are extremely important, and there's no room for that at all in policing. But we can all imagine a situation where there's bad behavior on the detective side, but then in the moment when the police officers are conducting the warrant, they don't have the knowledge that it's a bad warrant. They have good faith that they are doing what they are supposed to do, and at the moment that they enter the apartment, they take shots. One of the sergeants was shot in the leg, and they return fire. That it's a reasonable use of force, a reasonable officer-involved shooting. So this is something that I've been saying for a very long time, and Merrick Garland, who has no reason to support or say anything positive about any of the police officers. He specifically went out of his way to say that that the police officers who executed the warrant had no knowledge of this. So, and if you watch any of the media reports on this, at least for the last night and into this morning, no one is making the distinction there, because the idea that the shooting itself was unjustified is still a narrative that a lot of people are playing into, and the explaining it this way about how there's a separation between the two that was even called out by the Attorney General, that is not something that you're going to hear a whole lot of. So please put in the comments if you have any comments or questions about that. I did see someone actually put in the title of the book. I think it's called like 12 Seconds in the Dark or something to that effect. I haven't read it yet, but I have heard that sergeant on a couple different podcasts, and he was there that night. He was the one who was, I believe he was the one who was shot, so he does have some interesting things to say. So that's kind of an update on the Breonna Taylor case, and just one thing, because these detectives haven't been charged or haven't been convicted yet, that they've been charged, and like I said, if there's definitely a difference between the detectives being lazy, being incompetent, and purposely lying and doing something that is dishonest, and that would be criminal. So, when this goes to court, we'll see. If it's detectives being lazy and they just didn't put the work in that they should have, that's incompetence. If they did something criminal, that's completely different, and I don't think anyone would have any issue at all with detectives who put in knowingly false information and lie under oath, have any issue with them being charged with any crime, whether it's in state court or in federal court. So that's some of the Breonna Taylor case. Also, the next case that I wanna talk about. It's a really tragic case. It happened on July 15th in Hancock County, Georgia. The woman's name is Brianna Grier. She was 28 years old. So, I mean, this is an in-custody police officer death. It's on body cam. I think we're going to share a link to the actual body cam, so you can definitely go back and watch it. And I would encourage everyone to go back and watch the body camera footage of it. But let me just set this up a little bit. It's one of the most tragic in-custody police deaths that I've seen in a very long time. So Brianna Grier is a 28-year-old female, and she suffers from schizophrenia. And on this day, she was having a mental health crisis. She was in the middle of a crisis. Her mother is the one who called for police officers, and her mother reported a couple things. Her mother reported that she was out of control and that she was threatening family members, including her 2 young twin daughters. So she called for police officers to get some help. 2 deputies with the Hancock County Sheriff's Office, they arrived on scene. Where the body camera starts is Brianna Grier is on the ground, and she is yelling. So she's yelling something effective that she's not drunk, that she's willing to take a breathalyzer test. The police officers handcuff her, and they do something interesting. They handcuff her in the front. So her hands are handcuffed in the front. At this point, there's a decision that she's going to be arrested for misdemeanor domestic battery charges. So I'll get to it in a minute, but one of the questions I have is, some jurisdictions, when someone is in the middle of a mental health crisis, and if they've shown to be a danger to themselves or others, that's one of the ways that police officers can essentially, for lack of a better term, take someone's freedom away and make them go do a mental health evaluation. What that does, and a lot of times if there are only misdemeanor charges pending, that's something that police officers, by policy or just by police officers in the moment thinking this is the best thing for this individual, that's something that a lot of police departments do. So I question about whether or not that was even an option for these police officers there. But what happened in this case is, so they handcuff her in the front, they ask her multiple times to get in the car. Well, I think we all know what that's like when you have someone who just isn't in their right mind. Sometimes it's drugs, sometimes it's alcohol. But with Brianna, it's not something she did intentionally. She suffers from schizophrenia. Okay, so I mean, it's not her fault. She didn't do anything to make herself behave like this. So I think there's an added level of sympathy there, is that, so essentially one of the sergeants or one of the officers picks her up and kind of throws her in the car. Nothing unreasonable, but, they have to get her in the car. So I don't have an issue with that. Now, once she's in the car, they close the door really tight. The officer who is driving, and there are two different cars, the single officer cars. The officer who is driving that car isn't the officer who threw her in. Then he gets into the driver's seat, and before he does, he asks the officer who threw her in, who closed the door, and says, "Did you close the other side of the door, or is the other door closed?" And the other officer says yes. Now, if it's your police car, you're responsible to know if there's doors open and closed and stuff like that. But he gets in the car, they start driving. This is all on body cam. I'm glad, it's a good thing it's recorded. They start driving away, and she's in the passenger side. They also don't put a seatbelt on her, so she has her hands in the front. She has no seatbelt on, and she's sitting she's sitting or laying on the passenger side, the rear passenger side of the back seat. And even in the body cam, you can hear there's like a thump or a thud, and she fell out of a moving car. So they get out of the car, they stop, they say, Brianna, and they try to talk to her, and it seems like she's not conscious, but she's breathing at that point. EMS gets there. She does go into a coma, and she actually dies 6 days later. So that this just has so many questions about what happened. The first thing I want to know is, how could this happen? So I'm not a car expert. I don't know if we have any car experts in here, but if a door is closed, and so just one thing I should say is that the Georgia Bureau of Investigation has conducted an investigation and is conducting an investigation, and I read the last couple days on their website that they said that the reason that this happened, because at first it came out that maybe she had kicked the door. She had kicked the door open, which no one should be able to do anyways, but that was some of the initial reports on it. But what the Georgia Bureau of Investigation found after going to the car and doing some tests and investigation into the actual vehicle in the door is that the door wasn't shut all the way. So I'm still not clear if it wasn't shut at all or wasn't shut all the way. Now, for it to not be shut at all, like it's just wide open, that doesn't make much sense, because you would think that even in the driver's seat you'd be able to see that the door isn't open. But so they weren't exactly clear. There's no diagrams of exactly where it was. Now, there was another officer on scene, and at least as of now, the body camera footage from his car or from his body camera hasn't been released. So we don't know if maybe it's captured on there to answer some of these questions, but either way, the door wasn't closed all the way, and that's how she fell out. So a couple things about that. It's how is the door not closed all the way? But, and again, I'm not a vehicle expert. I don't know if anyone else is, but even if you have a door that is closed, if it's closed, even if it's not all the way locked, that isn't the kind of thing that typically just opens. Please, in the comments, correct me if I'm wrong. It's not the kind of thing that just opens by itself. And also, like with most vehicles, and especially in any police car that I've been in, if one of your doors is open, there's an indicator. There's a light sensor. Sometimes there's a dinging that goes on. Sometimes the dome light is on. So there's also internal mechanisms inside the vehicle, because is it possible that the door wasn't closed all the way? And that, the officer, as he's driving, if he didn't have any indication, that's one thing. But if there was something ringing or dinging or a light on, so that's good to know. On the body camera, it doesn't appear that Brianna is kicking, and at least when it comes to what you can hear on the body camera, there isn't anywhere that shows that that you can see that's obvious that it was let out. Or that any kind of an indication that the door was left open. So that was a pretty tragic case. Now, some of the questions that I have about that are some of them that I asked before. So, one of the ways they made a big deal about the seatbelt, because I'm sure it's part of their policy that, when you transport someone, you have to put them in a seatbelt. But she had her hands in the front. So if your hands are in the front, if you want to, you can seatbelt yourself. Also, you can take your seatbelt off. So if the officers had seatbelted her with her hands in the front, she could have taken that off of herself. So, really, do they have a policy there that when you arrest individuals, they have to be placed in the back? So what would that consist of if officers did that, wanted to put the handcuffs behind her back, and then if that's part of their policy? Well, think about it this way. So here she is. They had to pretty much use some level of force, maybe just low-level control tactics, but they had to use some force to actually get her in the car. Now she's in the car, her hands are in the front, okay? Can you imagine a situation where they say, oh, you know what? We really need her hands behind her back. So what they would have to do is they would probably have to take her out of the car, probably by force, and then probably have to use some more force to unhook one of the handcuffs and get both hands behind her back, and then they'd probably have to use force to get her in again. Well, what if she is tased or injured during that whole transfer? The criticism of police officers might be, hey, you had this lady in the car, she was already in there, and she's handcuffed in the front. She's not going anywhere, but you purposely went out of the way to drag her out of the car, handcuff her behind her back, and threw her back in. And during that time, if force was used. So I could see there being criticism there, but I would be curious to know does the Hancock County Sheriff's Office have a policy about where they're supposed to handcuff people, and if the individuals have to be placed in seatbelts? And it's hard to say if this is, was just, so it's obvious that there was no intention from the police officers to kill Brianna or to do anything to harm her. Like that, we know that wasn't the intention of the police officers. So the question is going to be, were the police officers just negligent enough to create a situation, to read that comment. Second, were they just negligent enough to create a situation where she lost her life? So we have a comment from Bruce Blankenship. I think you heard the thud of her falling out. You would have heard her kicking it open. If it wasn't partially lashed, it would take a good amount of force to kick it open. Bruce, those are my thoughts exactly. So the body camera, you cannot hear any kicking. Also, yeah, if it's partially latched, it should. You're 100% right. If it's just partially latched, then in order to get it open, you would think it wouldn't just come open by itself, that you would have to use some kind of significant force to get it open, if it would even open at all. And since there's no kicking that was heard, that makes it seem like either there was just a huge malfunction with the lock of the door, or maybe that door was just open, was not locked, but open maybe by like an inch, and that it was dark, there's no streetlights in this location, and it looked like to the officer that it was closed. Maybe initially Brianna, so I mean, typically we know that police officers put people in on the passenger side. That's normally what police officers do. So is it possible that the officer, before the body cam started or before was released, kind of opened the door just a little bit, maybe an inch, in the anticipation that Brianna is going to get in there, and then all of this happened, and then they just forgot that it wasn't completely closed? So that's something that could happen, and that's yes. Blue Pepper, let's see. Most cops have children, they would never transport them unbuckled, so why drive an aggressive person without a seatbelt? Yeah, and Blue Pepper, that is a great question. And the thing is, most police departments have policies that basically say that when you transport someone, that you have to buckle them. I guess my point about the individual being with the hands in the front, so if you have someone whose handcuffs are behind their back, which is typical, and you seatbelt them in, they're stuck. There's not much they can do. But I was just saying that if someone is handcuffed, and the officer didn't buckle her in this time, but if someone's handcuffs are in the front, and you buckle them in, well, they could easily just unbuckle that. So I'm curious about, for this police department, if they had either of those policies or training for police officers about having to buckle people in and where the handcuffs have to be or should be when they are taking someone to jail. So another thing on this is that I kind of mentioned it before. So because it was obvious that Brianna was in a mental health crisis, and the charges against her were only misdemeanor charges. So did this police department have the option to take her for a mental health evaluation, or was jail their only option? Maybe it's not the fault of the officers or the police department, that maybe jail was the only place that she could possibly go. But there are a lot of police departments in cities who do allow for individuals to be taken for mental health evaluations when this is the case. If that's the case, a lot of times police officers are able to call ambulances. So it just, if we're thinking about how do we avoid something like this in the future, it's not just Monday morning quarterbacking, it's what could we have done so this doesn't happen again, because what happened is worst case scenario for everyone involved. So that's a case that was just really sad. But when it comes to how police officers deal with and handle individuals who are in mental health crisis, that is a huge topic. And I think this case highlights a lot of those issues that law enforcement and police departments can do better Absolutely. And someone commented a minute ago, again, on the Brianna Taylor case, is that they said, didn't her boyfriend shoot first? Yes. So that is what happened. So just really quick back on that one. What Kenneth Walker said, and it pretty much comports with what the police officer said, is that once they entered the house, once they entered the apartment, Kenneth Walker said that he thought that someone was robbing them, committing a burglary. He thought it was someone, what Kenneth Walker is saying, that Brianna's boyfriend, is that he thought it was someone committing a crime or threatening them in some manner. He didn't know it was the police. So he said that he fired a warning shot. And those were his words. He fired a warning shot. Now, the shot didn't go in the ceiling. It didn't go in the ground. It went right into a police officer's leg. So we'll never know what's inside of his head, if he knew it was a police officer or not, or if he was trying to fire a warning shot. But yes, but he shot one time. He hit a sergeant in the leg. The sergeant almost bled out. And it was at that point that the police officers returned fire. And that was the reason why the actual use of force, deadly force by police officers in the Brianna Taylor case was reasonable, legal, and justified. Tragic, but it was reasonable for them to respond in the manner that they did. Now, one of the things about Mr. Walker is he didn't have a criminal history. So it's not like he had a warrant where, so I guess I'm trying to say is that Mr. Walker had no reason to shoot at police officers. He didn't have, unlike Brandon's ex-boyfriend, Mr. Walker didn't have a criminal history. He was a legal licensed gun owner. So he had no reason at being, 25, 28 years old to say, you know what, today's the day I'm going to shoot at a police officer for absolutely no reason. So, I mean, that to me, that seems to be an unreasonable thing. Now, it did happen late, so what seems like happened, it was a mistake of fact on behalf of Mr. Walker. He shot the police officers, but so he wasn't charged. He wasn't prosecuted because the DA believed his story. He didn't know it was a police officer, but it was also reasonable for the police officers to return fire once one of them was shot. That's reasonable. That's one of the times you can absolutely use deadly force, is when someone is firing a gun at you. So that was Brianna Taylor and Brianna Grier. Like I said, for the Brianna Grier, G-R-I-E-R, for the Brianna Grier case, I think we did post a link to the body cam, so please go watch that. I think it's an interesting case, and I think there could be a lot that comes from it. Also, this isn't necessarily police related, but it's an interesting story that I think a lot of people have opinions on. It's the Brittany Griner case. So, Brittany Griner, she plays on the WNBA basketball, which I do not follow. I like regular NBA basketball, but she's one of the best players in the WNBA basketball. Apparently, she plays overseas in Russia. And what happened is that, she was about 5 or 6 months ago when she was entering Russia, she was stopped at the airport because she had vape pens with less than an ounce of cannabis oil in them. It's completely legal here in the United States. I believe it was prescribed by her doctor, but severely illegal in Russia. So she was stopped, detained, arrested. She went to whatever Russia's version of a trial is, which probably isn't much of a trial, but she got 9 years in prison. The max penalty she could have gotten was 10 years. The prosecutor asked for 9.5 years, so she got 9 years in prison. Tyrone said, lucky it wasn't Saudi Arabia, they would have executed her. And you're 100% right on that. So that's what I wanted to talk about there, is that, listening to, and I covered this on my channel, there were a lot of comments about people saying something to the effect of, well, if you do the crime, you should do the time. And I get it. Listen, I'm a law and order guy. I think that we need laws, but we also need to be reasonable, and we should criticize bad ideas. So the comment about Saudi Arabia, that's exactly what I was going to say. So because you could get your head cut off in Saudi Arabia because you have less of an ounce of cannabis oil, because you can get your head cut off for that in Saudi Arabia, does that make it a good idea? Does that make it reasonable? No. So we should objectively be able to say, yes, we know these are the laws, but this isn't a good idea, and we should be able to question and criticize those bad ideas. So something that's legal in the United States, that you can get anywhere. There's vans that roll around in California and New York that sell exactly what Brittany Griner was convicted of in Russia. So she did get 9 years, and I know they're trying to do a prisoner swap where she's essentially become a political prisoner. Had politics been different, would her bag have even been checked? Probably not. So yeah, obviously this is a political prosecution with what's going on there. One of the people that they're also trying to get back is Paul Whalen. He is a citizen of the United States, the UK, and Ireland. He's a former Marine. He was given 16 years in prison in Russia for espionage, so I think we're trying to get him back as well. Also, there's an individual named Mark Fogle, who is a 60-year-old teacher who's lived in Russia with his family for a while, teaching English and stuff there, and he was convicted in 2021 for having just about an ounce of cannabis as well, or cannabis oil, or half an ounce of cannabis oil, and he was sentenced to 14 years in prison for that. So I think all of those people, we're trying to do some type of prisoner exchange. The people that Russia wants back are some pretty, as Trump would say, bad hombres. So I know there's a lot of opinions going back and forth. And I know that Brittany Griner, she was one of the people who was kneeling during the national anthem, and a lot of us don't like those politics. But despite that, we should be able to say, anyone being sentenced to 9 years in prison for something this silly is a bad idea. It is ridiculous in nature, and we'll see what happens. My prediction is that she will not do 9 years in prison, that there will be some type of prisoner swap, that we're going to get her back and Paul Whalen, maybe Mark Fogle, and we're going to give Russia a couple people who have actually committed some pretty terrible, violent crimes. So I don't know how fair that prisoner swap will be, but that is my guess as to what will happen there. So do we have any comments? Let's see. James says, I don't like kneeling for the anthem. I was in the military and have a bit more respect for our traditions than that. Yeah, James, that's a really good comment. I think a lot of people feel that way. And what I've seen at least a lot, like listening to different talk shows and some of the comments and some of the stuff that I've done, is that people comment, maybe she'll appreciate America now. Well, great. I hope that she does. I hope she appreciates our system of justice here, because it's probably the best one in the entire world. But just because she didn't have a full appreciation for it, I don't wish anything bad for her, and we shouldn't wish for people who might have different political ideas. I mean, she's still one of us. She's still an American. She's still on our team, even if we don't like some of her ideas. The best way to combat those ideas is to have those ideas in public and put forth better ideas. That's the best way to combat that. So, like I said, I'm not sure about the whole prisoner swap thing, but anyone who has to do 9 years in jail for that, it's a little silly, and I don't wish that upon anyone, even if I have different ideas on politics than her. And I know I touched on it. Let's see, protests. Let's see. Oh, goodness. Tyrone, if you hate America, these people should go to North Korea or China for the freedom. Yeah, there's not a whole lot of freedom in North Korea or in China. Protests aren't supposed to make you comfortable. No, protests aren't supposed to make you feel comfortable. It's important under the First Amendment. I think a lot of us just say protest as much as you want. Don't burn down cities. Don't burn down private businesses. And do not block highways, because it's really annoying. But yeah, say whatever you want. Stand on street corners, protest. I don't think anybody has a problem with that. Let's see. Okay. Yeah, Bruce, taking a knee for the anthem of a country where you have the option to take a knee is quite a conundrum. Yeah, I mean, that's exactly correct, is that, we have unlike other countries, we have the freedom to take a knee or not. That freedom, doesn't mean that people have to act in a certain way. It's the idea that people are free to make those decisions. That's what's valuable. That's what's important. That's what's great about the United States. Let's see. So I know I covered it a little bit last week, the case of Christopher Police, Sergeant Police. I know it sounds like I'm saying police. I'm not saying his name right. The way you spell it is Pullease. I think we're going to post a link to the body camera video of this, but I touched on it last week, but it's in Sunrise, Florida, and an individual is, and let me set this up a little bit, even though we did post a body cam, definitely go and check that out, because it's pretty astonishing body camera. I think this happened happened last fall. And essentially what happened here is that an individual is under arrest for, all the news said is some type of violent felony. Who knows what it is, but he's standing outside of a police car and he's giving the officers a hard time. They're telling him, sit in the car. And they go, you can go round and round with someone for an hour doing that. He's not sitting in the car. Finally, he sits in the car. Just about the time the individual sits in the police car, Sergeant Police, he rolls up on scene and he's coming in hot. Like this guy is not, he's not happy. And he, even at this point, he goes to the individual who's in the car and he starts screaming and yelling at the guy. Now, what probably happened is, and it doesn't show this on body camera, but the officers on scene probably put out over the air, or they just called their Sergeant Police, and said, hey, he's not getting in the car. What do you want to do? So, because the sergeant went there in a really bad mood with this guy for some reason. So my guess is, he had some indication or was called there for some reason. Either way, when he actually walked up to the car, the guy was sitting down. He was sitting down in the car. What the sergeant does is he basically goes into the back seat of the car. He leans in. He starts screaming at the guy saying, don't respect my officers. He takes out his OC, his mace. He threatens to mace the guy. And he says something to the effect of, if you ever disrespect my officers again, I'm going to rip your fucking soul from your fucking body. So as he's saying that and threatening to mace the guy who's in handcuffs and complying at this point. So all of this happens when the guy is complying. Maybe he's a bad guy. He committed a felony. He was giving officers a hard time. Fine. But at the time this happened, he was complying. So police officers have to treat the individual like there's someone who's complying. Just because someone was a jerk 5 minutes ago, you cannot take it out on them in the moment. So as he's doing this, there's 3 or 4 other officers standing around. Then there's a female police officer who's probably about a third of the size of the sergeant. As he's screaming and yelling at the guy, threatening to mace him, she does him a favor. She grabs him from the gun belt in the back and pulls him away. He immediately turns around, he takes his hand and he puts it on her neck and he pushes her back. And no one else steps in to do anything. Then he goes back just to get in one more word, and he screams and yells at the guy in the police car one more time. And then he yells at her. He says, I'll see you in my office in a few minutes. And then he tells everyone on scene to turn off your body cameras now. So that's maybe not the first problem we see with this, but anytime that something controversial happens or you're in the moment in something, when police officers turn off their body cameras in a situation like this, and especially when a supervisor orders to someone to turn off, the officers to turn off their body camera, something like this, like, it's never a good look. It is completely opposite of transparency and what we want from police departments. So the good news is that he was charged. So really, right after this happened, he was put on admin leave, and a outside agency conducted the investigation. Sergeant Police was charged with four charges, 2 of them felonies: battery on a police officer, assault on a police officer, and also tampering with evidence, I think, for telling the other officers and to turn off their body camera. So I did do this on my channel. I talked about this, and a lot of questions came about this, so I just want to kind of go into this because a lot of these cases aren't just about the facts of the case, but the issues that come up are systematic, and they come up in a lot of different cases. So if you let's see. James says, I think police needs to go easy on the steroids. Yeah, so everyone watched the body camera footage, but, if you've ever seen Breaking Bad, he looks like Hank from Breaking Bad, only, about a foot taller, 100 pounds heavier, and on steroids. So that's who this guy looks like. But, a lot of these cases, they touch on issues that are bigger than just the individual case. And in some of the comments, when I covered this story, that's what it went into here, is about police officers and body cameras. So some of the comments, and I really explored this a lot this week, is some of the comments is like, well, police officers shouldn't be able to turn off their body cameras. Why is there even an off button? So that's what a lot of people are saying. So I just want to go into that a little bit, and I'd be really interested to see what anyone here in the chat has to say about that. So do you think police officers should be able to turn off their body cameras? And even more extreme, should body cameras even have an off button? So think about what you're going to say there. I'm really curious to see what people's thoughts are. Or a mute button. That's a really good question. A mute button, yes. Well, we can get into that. But one of the things that I think is important to know is that most police departments have body cameras, have a policy that covers when police officers have to use their cameras. Now, maybe 5-10 years ago, it was, well, you record if you think something is going to happen. But, we all know situations where someone is being reasonable, being cool, and then all of a sudden it flips and, in the moment, the police officer thinks they're having a nice contact, something happens or someone else rolls up that they don't know is coming, and there's a use of force, and it's not on camera. And because it happened quickly, it's not the police officer's fault, and there wasn't really any violation of policy because it happened so quick. So now what a lot of more modern and progressive police departments are doing, I think it's actually a good deal, is essentially the policy reads something to the effect of all citizen contact has to be recorded. So if you're on a call, if you're on a traffic stop, you don't just record if you think something's going to happen or you think you're going to make an arrest. No, if you're having citizen contact on a call. Now, if you go into a gas station and you buy a Coke or a Monster, you don't have to record that. But if you're on any kind of official law enforcement duty, you record. And that's pretty much easy. If you're going to a call for service, the policy says start your camera before you exit the car. So these are probably, at least from the management of a police department side, that's probably the best thing for them to do. Anyway, so I think that's a way to fix this. And if officers violate that policy, you can go ahead and deal with that. But to say they shouldn't have an off button doesn't make a lot of sense. So just think about it this way. So police officers, they have to use the bathroom. They get a lunch break. So what if they're working out on a lunch break and they're at the substation at the gym? You want them to record the whole time that they're working out? How about if they're in between calls and they're writing a police report? It doesn't seem reasonable. Also, this is the very practical aspect of how much data for the servers would they be if every police officer recorded every minute of a shift? So it just wouldn't make sense for taxpayers to pay for all of that data and storage. It probably wouldn't even be possible. But if you think about it this way too, in an era where it's so hard to recruit police officers. And I know I said we're going to talk about Portland, but really it's about Seattle. So right now, Seattle police officers, if anyone wants to go be a Seattle cop, I think they're offering incentives up to $30,000 to be just an incentive just to get on hired at Seattle Police Department. So everywhere, even good, not that Seattle isn't a good police department, but places where people want to work are having a difficult time recruiting and retaining good, qualified, reasonable police officers. So now it's competitive. All these agencies want the same, good, decent officers. Imagine one of these departments says, hey, all day long, your whole shift, you have to record. If you could be in between a call, writing a report, maybe your husband or wife calls for a few minutes, all of that's recorded when you're in the bathroom, when you're at the gym. So can you imagine any reasonable police officer who has the option to work in other place, who would work in an environment like that? Pretty much nobody. Nobody reasonable would. And it's not that you want to hide anything. You can still have policies that say record all citizen contact. But the idea that if I'm in between calls and I'm writing a report and my buddy's sitting next to me, that I have to record our entire conversation. Again, this isn't, if there were thousands of people who wanted a few cop jobs, yeah, you can have all the unreasonable policies. You want people to take those jobs. That isn't the reality now. So I just, from a recruitment and a retention standpoint for police officers, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Let's see. Let's see if we got some other comments on that. I'm sure people have said a lot of things. Yeah, James agrees. Data storage, yes. Data storage is definitely an issue. Serial killer, that's a great name. I would never want to be a cop this day and age. Yeah, I think that's what a lot of people say, is that it's a difficult time to be a police officer. But doing things like having a body camera, make sure that you run your body camera while you're having citizen contact, all of that stuff can definitely help protect you as a police officer. Ego 10, okay. Unless they're on our tax dollars, they're on film and being held accountable. Okay, I'm not sure exactly. Let's see, they need to require more, train more, and get paid way more. I agree. Okay, so I like where the Ego 10, I like where that's going. So that's what people say. We need better cops. We need more educated police officers. They need more training. They need this, they need this. I agree. But a lot of times, and obviously Ego 10 doesn't think that, which is good, but a lot of times they say, and they criticize the police of all these things. and we have to defund the police. Okay, well, that doesn't make any sense. All of these things you're asking for to make police departments and police officers better, things that we all agree with, yes, we would all want this, they all cost money. They all cost more money. So better police officers, better training, better equipment, crisis intervention units that can go out to these calls so the cases like Brianna Grier maybe don't happen. Yes, all of that is more expensive. So we need more funding for reasonable things to make police departments better. James Ortiz, I'd be a cop. The pay is good starting at $40K. Yeah, starting at $40K. Yeah, you know what? I mean, there's a lot of police, like I said. So Seattle police, if you want to go be a Seattle cop, they'll give you a $30,000 bonus, and without overtime. I know the cost of living there is high. I get it, but you'll probably start out somewhere around $80,000 a year. I have one of my good friends I went to law school with is a police. He's actually an assistant police chief in a small town in Texas, and he makes less than $20 an hour. So, police department salaries, they vary widely depending upon where you go. So those are really the cases that I wanted to talk about this week that I thought that were important. There are a couple other cases that I know I asked last week, hey, if you have a case, put it in the chat. So I just wanted to, Only Cops, if you guys don't follow the Only Cops channel, please go do that. They are put out awesome content. But Only Cop says you can make $40,000 working the warehouse at Costco without all the bullshit. That makes sense. Yes, you probably can. I don't know. Yeah, yes, that's a very reasonable comment. You absolutely can. But I know that I put in the someone put in the comments, there's a case, police officer by the last name of Cox, C-O-X, and I can't remember what state it was in, but there was a shooting. The officer went there and detained the individual outside of a bar. So I can't remember who said it. I told him I would look into that case, and I am. There's been some conflicting information on that, and the body camera just came out. So I am looking into that one. I will have that one for you next week with some reasonable information, opinions on it. So if you have any other cases that you want us to talk about, put it in the chat, because it's something that we definitely look at, and if it's an interesting case, it's definitely something that we want to get out to you. Let's see. Ego 10, can we talk about a Border Patrol agent? Let's see. Border Patrol agent who murdered his neighbor's dog. So I remember hearing about that in the news, but I haven't done a deep dive on that. So yeah, let me look into that for next week. Blue Pepper says, what amazes me most, the U.S. has body cameras, Europe has none, 3 years of education, and has no police violence. So I wouldn't say they have. No, I don't like the term police violence. I can get into that a different day. But, a use of force by police officers. So there definitely is use of force by police officers in Europe. I'm most familiar with some of the stuff that's going on in Britain, in the United Kingdom. Those officers, only certain officers carry guns. Not all of them carry guns. I think they have tasers. I just saw a case recently in Britain where there was an individual who was having a mental health crisis, and they tried to tase him. The taser didn't work, and as they were trying to it did work. Finally, the taser actually did work, and while the individual was under power, they didn't handcuff him right away. After the 5-second jolt from the taser, he got up and he went and he jumped off a bridge and killed himself. So there are issues with police in other places, but you have to look at it this way, is that the violence and the murder rate in a lot of these countries and the access to citizens having firearms and use those firearms against police officers aren't the same, so the danger isn't as great. Let's see. James Ortiz, 40 years ago, they paid cops minimum wage $7 an hour. Yeah, I don't know who would do that now, but yes, absolutely. And knife attacks are on the rise in Europe, so they do have that problem there. Those were the cases that I thought were interesting that I wanted to talk about this week. If you have any other questions and comments, put it in there. And like I said, definitely let us know if there are any interesting cases throughout the week that you want to put in there. And again, some of the cases we talked about today, we did put the body cams out there, so go and watch for yourself. And, if you have questions, we can readdress them next week. Otherwise, I do want to tell everyone to have a nice weekend. Have a nice and safe weekend. You could please please subscribe to the Cop Watch TV channel, and so you know exactly when we're doing this. We do this every Friday, and you can go follow me at Police Law News. And that's it. Have a good night.